Good evening again. Our assignment this evening was to share our experience of faith with each other and to be mutually encouraged in the process. And I expect that those of us who will be sharing some faith reflections with you this weekend will each approach it somewhat differently, and that's exactly the way it should be. I'm not sure exactly what makes sense, but let me simply share with you how I have experienced my faith throughout my life. And since our habit is normally to talk about God in the abstract or to reflect on how my intellectual beliefs impact my values or my actions, I've chosen this evening to share with you more concretely how I have personally experienced the presence of God in my life. Now, in order to understand me, you will need to know a little bit about my background. I grew up in a small Mennonite church in northern Ontario, about 10 kilometers west of Sudbury, in a family that had moved to northern Ontario to do church planting in the mid to late 40s. So I grew up in a context that was simply immersed in faith and a sense of God's presence, I would say. There was the bedtime stories every night, the Bible stories, the Sunday school, the Bible school, the kids club, Sunday worship. Church, faith, God's presence was simply a normal part of my life as I grew up. But then I made a startling discovery in my grade 5 social studies class. The teacher asked us, we're all Canadians, but what's your ethnic background? I knew the answer right away, but I thought I'd better check with my mom first. But then I was shocked to discover that ethnically I was Swiss. You see, all those Bible stories I was immersed in, I just always assumed that I was Jewish. In fact, I was a little disappointed to find out that I was this Mennonite Swiss Anabaptist. But it then put me on a journey of figuring out, well, what did that all mean? And I started to hear something of those stories of the Anabaptists. But growing up in that context, I think I just always had a sense of God's presence. I grew up surrounded by woods and hills and streams and long walks on my paper route. And I was actually one of those strange kids that actually enjoyed morning watch at summer camp, sitting under a birch tree at Silver Lake, just kind of knowing that God was there at 7 a.m. in the morning. So I think I've always had a bit of a sense of God's presence, a sense of belonging to God and belonging to a faith community. But all of that shattered for me in my second year of university at the University of Waterloo. I'd enrolled in my first year in an outdoor education that made sense with my camp background, and unexpectedly that year I had one elective course I could take. And so I decided to take Introduction to New Testament with John Rempel at Conner-Gable College. And I was introduced to that fascinating field of biblical studies. I was so intrigued, I switched that year from outdoor ed to the religious studies program. But in my second year, the intellectual and emotional conflict between what I was learning and the simple, naive faith that I had inherited came to a breaking point. I could no longer hold the two in tension anymore, and I collapsed into acute clinical depression, pushed me to the brink of my coping abilities, including thoughts of suicide. In the midst of that incredibly dark time, I would say I experienced something of a miracle in my life. Over the next half year, it felt like the unseen hand of God was at work, literally rebuilding my sense of self, my identity, and my faith. It kind of felt like the shattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle were being put back together, but this time stronger, more resilient, and in a way that wove together both my experience of divine presence and my new intellectual understandings of Scripture and faith. Not many years later, I was introduced to a book by Don Postema called Space for God, and was introduced there to a metaphor from the Russian Orthodox spirituality. This phrase of descending with the mind into the heart. That image continues to be an enduring one for me, and I've learned to trust its truth. No matter how extensively my understanding of faith or my experience of God has grown, I've discovered that divine presence and intellectual honesty are never at odds, but are always two integrated companions to authentic spirituality. Or, in the Latin words of St. Anselm, the 11th century Christian philosopher that I first saw in my history professor's office, fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. Two strong aversions have been deeply seared into my heart from that challenging experience as a young adult. Firstly, a very deep aversion to an experiential faith that is unwilling or fearful to open itself to intellectual rigor. Secondly, a very deep aversion to a well-formed intellectual faith that is unwilling or fearful to abandon itself in trust to the experience of the divine. Personally, I refuse to give up either. So over the years, I've nurtured that kind of spirituality, and the disciplines of prayer and meditation have been a central part of my life and my experience of God. And I've discovered that although I'm engaged in a context like this and by meeting people and interacting with people, I'm also energized by forms of prayer and silent retreats that draw me into deep quiet and solitude. When I began my role as executive minister with MCEC, I engaged a year-long discipline of the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which required an hour of prayer a day and a weekly check-in with a spiritual director. This actually began for me an annual pattern of going on an 8-day silent directed retreat, which I've almost done annually since I've been in this position. I've experienced 8-day retreats as places of profound encounter with God's presence. Each retreat seems to have contributed in some way to a profound spiritual encounter that's led to deep emotional and spiritual healing in my life. Ignatian Spirituality uses Scripture in an imaginative way and invites us to enter the text experientially. I'll just give you a taste of that. This past summer, I was working with the text of Peter walking on the water to Jesus, and I chose to imagine myself as Peter. And as I'm walking in the water, I can feel myself sinking and crying out, "Lord, save me." And in that moment, there was just this strong sense that Christ was there grasping my arm and holding it almost physically, just a strong sense of presence, that enough that you step back and go, oh, something happened here that I did not expect or anticipate. And you know that somehow you have been touched by divine presence. And in fact, that image has sustained me through some challenging times this past year. My experience of God is not only in an internal spiritual sense, it's also a strong sense of God's presence in my life mediated through others and through external circumstances. These experiences have given me confidence that God is mysteriously present and at work in the world and in the circumstances of my life. My experience has been that when I've reached the limits of my personal capacity, that God often extends that capacity through others. The right word of wisdom, the timely offer of support, the generous and willing response to a request for help, unexpected finances when you didn't anticipate it. It seems like something is there that God is providing and you didn't quite know that it would be there. Example for me, recently I was just back from a 3-week teaching tour to Burma. 2 weeks before I left, I was told, oh, you're supposed to be teaching on Galatians. Well, that was news to me, and I had 1 week of holidays scheduled and a very busy week after that. Well, where do I start looking at Galatians? Well, I started looking at a few things. I walked across the hall at 50 Kent to Mennonite Media and said, where's your Believers Anabaptist commentary on Galatians? Oh, well, it's coming out March 17. Yeah, thanks. Right in the middle of my teaching tour. Well, how about getting a digital copy? Is there a PDF of the thing? Well, let me check it out. Well, thank you, Craig. I got George R. Brunk III's advanced copy of the text, and it was a beneficial tool for me on that teaching tour. It was just like, but it felt like God's hand of support in a very concrete way. Let me give you one more example. This one was none too subtle. Several years ago, I had been through an exhausting, demanding meeting at very many different levels. And I was driving away from the meeting. I was loudly protesting to God, simply, I can't do this anymore. This just is too much for me. It's exhausting. It's complicated. You're asking the impossible of me. I just can't do it. Deep in thought, I looked up at the traffic in front of me as I was braking, and there the license plate on the car just ahead of me loudly proclaimed, "Yes, I can." I just about fell out of the driver's seat. Like, there was just a deep sense that I had been spoken to. And I don't know how you explain that kind of thing, but for me it felt like the voice of God was there and confirming that God is somehow active and present in my life. And so through inner and outer experiences of God, through prayer, worship, and work, I have experienced a God who continually puts the pieces of my life back together. A God who is somehow alive within me and whose unseen hand is continually remaking my life, however slowly or painfully, into the likeness of Jesus Christ. In doing that within the context of my family, my home congregation, my work, and the wider community of faith. So we're kind of asked, well, if you were sharing your faith, how would you put that in non-religious words? I would say this is my best attempt at that. If I were to have to tell someone who didn't know anything about God and my experience of God, I'd probably say something like this. As I go about my daily life, I've experienced a loving, forgiving, compassionate presence that supports me and wants the best for me. This presence is what many people call God, and my understanding of this divine presence has been deeply shaped by what I have learned from the life and teachings of Jesus. My sense is that the same spiritual presence that I think shaped Jesus' life is also shaping my life, and I've also experienced those changes to be for the better. I think I'd also say I experience this presence both inwardly as well as through the presence and actions of other people and life circumstances. This presence in my life has increased my personal capacity for love and compassion, and it nudges me to share what I have received with others. I think I would say I'm also more aware of this presence when I intentionally try to be alert for it and when I connect with other people who are trying to do the same thing. This presence was instrumental and continues to be instrumental in putting my life back together, and I believe it wants to do the same thing wherever healing and wholeness are needed in our personal lives and wherever justice and peace are needed in the societies in which we live. So let me conclude with a personal confession. This has been an interesting and helpful assignment, but it also very much reminds me that I live in a very Christian ghetto. My life evolves around the church. Even my work is within the context of the church. Even if I become more comfortable talking about and sharing my experience of God with those who are not in the church, when do I even have the opportunity to do that? I've been pondering over the past year how I might more meaningfully engage my neighbors or people in my community. On Monday mornings, I curl in a church-based curling club. Even my recreation is in the church. I've wondered about, should I take the extra time to belong to a community curling club? Would that mean I give up the church-based one that connects me ecumenically with other pastors? My experience is not just one of becoming more comfortable with talking about my faith experience and finding everyday language to speak about it. It's also the issue of having the time or context in which to relate to other people not even connected with the faith community. So how do I steward this gift of faith I've received? I'm not always sure. Maybe it's time for more prayer.